March 14, 1977. Nashville, Tennessee. The Ryman Auditorium. The building that built country music was packed to its pine pew walls. 2,200 people had paid to be there, and half of them had never paid to see Dolly Parton headline anything, not alone, not without Porter Wagoner's name above hers on the marquee. But tonight his name wasn't on anything. Tonight, the marquee outside on Fifth Avenue said one word. One name. Hers. The first two songs went down like thunder through old wood. The Ryman did what it always did with real sound, swallowed it whole and gave it back bigger, warmer, fuller than any amplifier on earth could manufacture. The crowd was on its feet before the second chorus of the opener. Industry people in the third and fourth rows, RCA men, radio programmers, the ones who decided what got played and what got buried, were leaning forward in their seats. Not taking notes. Just listening. Then, 40 seconds into the third song, Ray Benson's right hand locked up. His fingers seized on the strings. His shoulders dropped forward. And then his knees went, and the man folded onto the stage floor like something inside him had simply stopped holding. His guitar hit the wood with a crack that tore through the microphones and bounced off the back wall. The music stopped. Every instrument, every voice, stopped. 2,200 people forgot how to breathe. The stage crew moved. Stagehands rushed in from the wings. The crowd surged forward in their seats, necks craning, voices dropping to urgent whispers that ran through the hall like a current. Dolly Parton stepped to the microphone. No panic in her voice. No performance either. She told the house Ray would be all right. Heat, dehydration. The doctor was already backstage. Then she paused, laid her hand flat against the body of her guitar, looked out at 2,200 people and asked a question she had never asked in her life. Is there anyone in this room who can play this guitar? For a moment, no one moved. The RCA man in the third row looked at his shoes. A stagehand looked at another stagehand. 2,200 people looked at each other, and the silence in that old building had a weight to it, the kind of silence that means everyone is waiting for someone else to be brave. A few hands went up halfway. Unsure. The kind of gesture that says I'll try without promising anything. Dolly nodded at them gently, the way you nod at courage when courage is all someone has to offer. But the music she needed wasn't something courage alone could carry. Then, from the left side of the hall, row 11, second seat from the aisle, a tall figure in black rose slowly from his seat. Nobody called his name. The lights were on the stage, not the seats. All anyone saw was a man in black standing up in a room where every other person had stayed sitting down. For 3 full seconds, nobody understood what they were looking at. But this moment didn't start there. It started 6 days earlier, in a phone call Dolly Parton almost didn't answer. 6 days earlier, March 8, 1977. A house in Hendersonville, Tennessee. The morning was cold and gray, the kind of February lingering cold that forgets it's supposed to be gone by March. Dolly Parton was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk yet, and a letter she'd written the night before but hadn't mailed. 3 pages, longhand on plain white paper. No rhinestones. No performance. Just a daughter writing to a father who was running out of time. Robert Lee Parton Sr. was dying up in Sevier County. Lung deterioration, slow and certain. He had never come down from the mountain to see her headline a full house. He had seen her on television, caught her voice on the radio in the cab of his truck on the long roads between the Hollow and town. But he had never sat in a seat and watched his daughter carry a room alone. And now the doctors were saying the window for that was closing. The March 14th show at the Ryman was supposed to be her answer to everything Nashville had done to her in the 2 years since she walked away from Porter Wagoner. Porter had sued her. The papers had printed every detail like it was sport. Industry people had picked sides the way they always did, quietly, carefully, with one eye on who was going to be useful to them next. The Ryman show was Dolly's statement. Not with words. With a stage. But she hadn't told anyone what it was really carrying. The phone rang. She picked it up on the second ring. June Carter Cash didn't open with hello. She opened with a name. John's been in his room for 4 days, June said. He hasn't touched a guitar. I thought you should know. Dolly set her coffee cup down. She knew what 4 days without a guitar meant for Johnny Cash. She had seen the other version of that silence, the dangerous one, and she knew the difference between a man resting and a man disappearing into himself. "Is he coming to the show?" Dolly asked. June was quiet for a moment. Then, "He doesn't know I called you." Dolly looked across the kitchen at the Stella archtop guitar leaning against the far wall, the one her father had bought her when she was 9 years old, $5 and a promise he couldn't afford but made anyway. She looked at it the way you look at something that has never lied to you. She didn't call Cash. She didn't send word. If he was going to come, he was going to come the way he always came to the things that mattered to him, through a back road nobody else thought to take, in his own time, on his own terms, without anyone's permission or anyone's invitation. She picked up the 3-page letter, folded it once, and mailed it to the Hollow in Sevier County that afternoon. She didn't know if her father would read it before the show. She didn't know if Cash would walk through the Ryman's doors on the 14th. She knew only 2 things with any certainty: the show was 6 days away, and the stage would either hold everything she was carrying or it wouldn't. That night, she played the Stella archtop alone in the kitchen until midnight, singing to nobody, the way she had sung to the mountains as a girl when there was no one else to hear it. March 14, 1977. The Ryman Auditorium. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Dolly arrived 3 hours before showtime. Alone. No entourage, no stylist, no road manager walking 2 steps behind her with a clipboard. She came in through the side door on 5th Avenue, the one the stagehands used, and she walked out onto the stage before anyone else was there to see her do it. The Ryman in the afternoon was a different building than the Ryman at night. Without the crowd, without the house lights up and the stage spots burning, it settled into something older and quieter, the sound of pine wood and memory and a century of people who had stood in this exact spot and asked the room to believe them. Gospel congregations had filled these pews before country music claimed the building. Hank Williams had stood on this floor. Patsy Cline had stood on this floor. The Wood remembered all of it, and on a quiet afternoon it gave that memory back in the form of silence that had a particular weight to it, the kind that asks something of you before you ever open your mouth. Dolly walked to the center of the stage and stood there for a long moment without speaking. She looked out at the empty seats, 2,200 of them, filling the floor and climbing the balcony in a horseshoe curve that bent the room around the stage like cupped hands. She had played this building before, but always as a supporting act, always with someone else's name carrying the marquee. Tonight the seats would fill for her, and she felt the full weight of that in a way she hadn't let herself feel it until right now, in the quiet, with nobody watching. Ray Benson ran the sound check at 6 o'clock. 11 years her lead guitarist, and he ran the set clean. Twice through, no stumbles, every transition landing exactly where it needed to land. The band was tight. The monitors were right. The Fender twin reverb on the left side of the stage was running warm and clean, the way old tubes do when they've been trusted long enough to find their voice. But backstage, with 2 hours before showtime, the RCA men started their quiet work. They moved in the way industry men always moved in situations like this, not with confrontation, but with suggestion. A quiet word to the road manager. A gentle observation that the set might open stronger on familiar ground. The Porter-era hits. The songs that had already proven themselves on radio. The safe choices. The ones that reminded nobody of anything too new or too raw or too Dolly without permission. Dolly heard the suggestion relayed to her in the dressing room. She was sitting in front of the mirror, the full armor of the performance already on. The rhinestones, the sequins, the hair that Nashville had turned into a punchline because they didn't understand that a woman who builds her own image that boldly isn't asking for approval. She listened to the full message. Nodded once. Said nothing. Then turned back to the mirror. The woman looking back at her from the glass was not the woman the RCA men were making suggestions to. The woman in the mirror was the girl from Locust Ridge, Sevier County, who had learned to sing by pressing her mouth against a tin can and pretending it was a microphone, because real microphones were not things that existed in a 2-room cabin on a mountain in 1954. That girl had carried herself down from the mountain and across every stage Nashville had put in front of her, and she had never once let a man in a suit tell her what the audience needed to hear. She stood up, picked up her guitar, walked toward the stage. The house lights were coming up. The crowd was pouring through the front doors, filling the pews from the floor to the balcony. Dolly watched from the wings, the sound of 2,200 people finding their seats, the energy building the way it only builds in rooms that know what they're holding. Then she saw it. Row 11. Left side. Second seat from the aisle. A tall figure in a black jacket moving quietly into the seat without looking left or right. No greeting to the people around him. No phone, no program. He sat down the way a man sits down when he has already made a decision and the deciding is done. She couldn't see his face from the wings, but she recognized the posture. The absolute stillness of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has learned to carry it without showing the weight. She turned to her stage manager. "Who is in row 11? He didn't know. Walk-up ticket. Cash. Crumpled bills at the window, no name given. Dolly said nothing. She looked back at row 11 for one more breath. Then she tightened her grip on the guitar and walked out onto the stage. She had a show to open. Whatever row 11 meant, it would keep until after the music started. It didn't keep long. This channel tells the stories the industry tried to bury. Subscribe, because what happens when that man in row 11 stands up will change everything you thought you knew about who these two people were to each other. The third song was 40 seconds in when Ray Benson's hand locked up. Dolly heard it before she saw it. The half-beat hesitation in the chord change, the string that didn't ring clean, the small wrong silence where the lead was supposed to come in and didn't. She turned just as Ray's shoulders dropped forward. His fingers were frozen against the strings, his face white under the stage lights, and then his knees went and the man went down hard on the Ryman's old wood floor. His guitar hit with a crack that tore through every microphone on the stage and bounced off the back wall of the balcony. The music stopped. Every instrument, every voice, every breath in the building stopped. 2,200 people surged forward in their seats. Stagehands rushed in from both wings. Don Wharton, her steel guitar man, stepped back from his instrument and moved toward Ray without being asked. The band held their positions, unsure, watching Dolly the way musicians watch a bandleader when the map disappears, waiting for a sign that tells them which direction steady is. Dolly watched the stagehands carry Ray toward the wings, and then she turned back to the microphone, and her face carried none of what she was feeling. That was the craft. 20 years of learning how to stand in front of a room and give it exactly what it needs, and what this room needed right now was a woman who was not afraid. She told the house Ray would be all right. Heat, dehydration. The doctor was already there. Nothing serious. Then she paused, laid her palm flat against the body of her guitar, looked out at 2,200 people and asked the question, "Is there anyone in this room who can play this guitar?" The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. Not empty, full of 2,200 people calculating their own courage and finding it just short of the moment. A few hands went up halfway. Dolly nodded at them, gentle and real. "I see you," her eyes said. But the music she needed wasn't something halfway courage could carry tonight. In row 11, Johnny Cash sat with his hands flat on his knees. He had driven to Nashville alone that morning. A black Ford, because Cash trusted steel that lasted, not models that changed with the market. He had bought his ticket at the window with crumpled bills, no plastic, no name given. He had found row 11, second seat from the aisle, and he had sat down and listened to Dolly Parton open a room that needed opening, and he had felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked tight for 4 days. That was why he had come. Not to be seen. Not to perform. To remember what real music felt like when someone else was carrying it. Now the room had gone quiet in a different way. Nashville's voice came first, the way it always did. The boardroom voice. The one that had been making the rounds in the hallways of Columbia Records for the better part of a year, the sentence that everybody knew and nobody claimed out loud. His time is over. His hands were too far gone. The boom chicka boom was a relic. Nobody wanted the man in black anymore. They wanted something newer, shinier, easier to sell to a generation that didn't know what a Sun Records session smelled like. His hands shifted on his knees. 46 years of calloused, steel-strung, working hands. The hands that had played for Sam Phillips in 1955 when he was 18 years old and sweating through his shirt at the door of a Memphis studio, Not sure if he was a singer or just a man who wanted to be one. The hands that had played Folsom Prison in 1968 in front of men who were never supposed to hear music like that and could not stop listening. The hands June had found shaking over a glass of water 4 nights ago, and had not said a single word about, because June Carter Cash understood her husband in the way that only a person who has watched someone fight themselves for 20 years can understand another human being. Could they still do it? Nashville said no. But Dolly's voice was coming from a stage, not a boardroom. And the silence in this hall was the same silence that had been in Sam Phillips' studio the morning Cash walked in without an appointment and played until the man had no choice but to listen. Some silences ask to be filled. Some silences are the whole question. Johnny Cash stood up. One motion. No theater in it. The kind of standing up that happens when a decision has already been made somewhere below the level of thought. When the body simply follows what the soul decided 3 seconds ago without consulting anyone. He planted his boots on the Ryman's pine floor, drew himself to full height, and stepped into the aisle. The house lights were on the stage. The crowd was watching Dolly. Nobody saw him move. He walked through the dark aisle the way he always walked toward the things that mattered, long, steady strides, no hesitation once the direction was set, 25 years of muscle memory carrying a man toward the one place he had always belonged. People in the aisle stepped aside without looking at his face. A tall man in black was walking. That was all they registered. That was all they needed to. He reached the stage steps. Don Warden was standing at the bottom, steel guitar pick still in his hand, watching the aisle because something in the air had shifted and Don had spent enough years on stages to know when a room was about to change. He saw the tall figure step out of the dark. He looked at the jacket first. But then the boots, worn, heavy, the kind of boots that have shaped themselves to one man's feet over decades of concrete stages and tour bus floors. Then the face. Don Warden lowered his pick. Nodded once. Stepped back from the stairs without a word. Johnny Cash climbed those steps. Left knee carrying the ache of 25 years of stages, but he didn't let it show. The same way he had never let it show, the same way every craftsman carries the cost of his craft in the private places where audiences never look. He reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the stage light for the first time. The RCA man in the 3rd row went rigid in his seat. Dolly turned from the microphone. She saw him. Not surprise on her face, something older and quieter than surprise. Recognition. The kind that lives between two people who have watched each other fight the same fights from different corners of the same broken industry, who have never needed to explain themselves to each other because the explanation was always there in the music. She didn't announce him. She didn't reach for the microphone to tell the room what it was looking at. She simply reached out, lifted Ray Benson's Gibson J200 from the stand beside her, and held it toward him. Johnny Cash took it, settled the strap over his shoulder, ran one chord, just one open G, bare and dry, and the Ryman did what the Ryman always did with honest sound. It took it up into the old wood of the ceiling and gave it back changed. Fuller. Older. Like the building itself was agreeing with the choice. Dolly stepped back to her microphone. Looked at him across the 6 feet of stage between them. One word, Jolene. Cash shook his head slow. Not mine to play, he said. You play Jolene. I'll hold the door open. And that was exactly what he did. Dolly sang Jolene with Johnny Cash laying the rhythm underneath, boom chicka boom wrapped in the Ryman's cathedral warmth, the Gibson's low-end resonance cradling her voice the way a riverbank holds water, steady and unasked for and essential. The first verse landed and the crowd recognized the song and a sound went through the hall. Not applause, something quieter and more powerful than applause. The sound of 2,200 people realizing simultaneously that they were inside something that was not going to happen again. Not like this. Not in this room, on this night, with these two people standing 6 feet apart on this particular floor. The RCA men in the 3rd row were not executives anymore. They had stopped taking notes. They were just people in a room, which is the only thing music ever asks anyone to be. Second song, Cash called it himself. He turned to Dolly and said 2 words. Coat of many colors. Dolly's eyes went somewhere private for just a moment, the half-second flicker of a woman touching something she keeps in a place most people never get to see. That song was her mother's hands. Her mother cutting patches from rags and sewing them into a coat for a little girl who was going to be mocked for wearing it and who wore it anyway because her mother's hands had made it and love was the only lining it needed. Cash knew what that song carried. He had known for years. That was why he called it. He played the introduction alone. Single chord, open and bare, the Gibson ringing in the Ryman's old air. Then Dolly's voice came in, and the building went so quiet that people in the back of the balcony could hear the wood settling around them. When the last note fell, nobody moved. 5 seconds. The whole room holding still the way rooms only go still when something true has just been said. Then the house came apart. 2,200 people on their feet, the sound rising into the Ryman's ceiling and coming back down changed. The way everything that enters this building comes back changed. Because some rooms are built not just to hold sound but to hold the meaning inside it. Dolly walked to the microphone. She didn't say his name. She said something else entirely, and what she said stopped Johnny Cash in his tracks. Dolly Parton stood at the microphone and let the applause run for a full 10 seconds before she raised her hand to quiet it. She didn't look at the crowd when she spoke. She looked at Johnny Cash. "This man," she said, "bought a ticket tonight at the box office window. Paid cash. Crumpled bills, the kind a man carries in his jacket pocket, not his wallet. He found row 11, second seat from the aisle, and he sat down in the middle of this hall and he listened. He didn't come backstage. He didn't call ahead. He didn't ask for a seat in the wings or a mention in the program or a single thing that most men in his position would have considered the bare minimum of what they were owed." She paused. The room was completely still. "When my guitarist went down tonight, a lot of people in this building looked at the floor. This man stood up." Another pause. Shorter this time. "My daddy taught me something when I was young enough that I had to stand on my toes to see over the kitchen table. He said, you can learn everything you need to know about a man by watching what he does when nobody's asking him to do anything." Tonight, 2,200 people were watching. But John didn't know that when he stood up, Johnny Cash was standing at the side of the stage with his back half turned to the audience, the Gibson J200 hanging loose in his right hand. He was looking at the floor. Not from shame, from the particular privacy of a man who is receiving something he doesn't know how to hold in public. He had walked onto this stage to fill a silence. He had not walked on to be seen. Those were two completely different things, and Dolly had just said the one true thing about him that he had never been able to say about himself. He walked to the microphone. Stood there for a moment with the hall waiting. "I came tonight to hear Dolly Parton sing," he said. His voice was dry and low, the baritone that had come up from the same chest that had carried every hard year of his life without collapsing. "Turns out she came to remind me what a stage feels like." 2 sentences. Nothing more. He stepped back from the microphone and handed the Gibson to Don Warden and walked toward the stage steps without looking back at the crowd. The applause followed him down the stairs and he didn't turn around for it. He had come tonight as the audience and he was leaving the same way. That was the intention. That had been the whole intention from the moment he bought the ticket. He didn't make it to the door. Standing at the base of the stage stairs, half in shadow, arms folded across his chest and one boot crossed over the other, Chris Christopherson. Leather jacket, dark jeans, hat pulled low enough to mean he hadn't wanted to be recognized either. He had come to the Ryman that night to surprise Dolly and had ended up watching the whole thing from the wings with a glass in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has just witnessed something he knows he will spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately and failing. He looked at Cash walking toward him through the narrow corridor at the bottom of the stairs. "You couldn't have called and told me?" Chris said. Cash stopped, looked at him, and laughed. A real laugh, dry and short and coming from somewhere deep. The kind of laugh that only comes out of a man when he is caught completely off guard by something true. "Didn't know I was coming," Cash said. 20 minutes later, the three of them were in a narrow room backstage. Folding chairs, a card table, a radio in the corner running low. Dolly had the Stella archtop, the $5 guitar her father had bought her on a promise, in her lap. She wasn't playing it. Just holding it the way you hold something that has been with you through everything and hasn't broken yet. Chris had his boots up on the table. Cash was leaning against the wall with a Lone Star in his hand, looking at nothing in particular. Nobody was talking. 20 years of knowing each other doesn't need words to fill the space between people. The silence was its own conversation. Then Chris set his bottle down on the table and said what everyone in the room was already thinking but hadn't found the sentence for yet. You two ever actually record something together? Just the two of you? No label, no production meeting, no suits in the room telling you what it needs to sound like. Neither Dolly nor Cash answered. But neither of them said no. The next morning, a telegram arrived at the house in Hendersonville. Sevier County postmark. Dolly's hands were not entirely steady when she opened it. Her father had listened to the show on the radio. The Ryman broadcast had carried all the way up into the hollow. He had heard Ray go down. He had heard the silence. He had heard the boom-chicka-boom come up from the floor when a man in black stood up in row 11, and he had heard his daughter's voice come back over the top of it like it had never left. Robert Lee Parton Sr. had written 4 words. That's my girl, Daddy. Dolly folded the telegram carefully. She opened the Stella archtop case and placed it inside, against the velvet, next to the 3-page letter she had never heard back about until right now. She closed the latch. Stood there with both hands resting on the case for a long moment, the way you stand when something has been answered that you didn't know you were waiting on. The March 14th show at the Ryman Auditorium did not make the front page of any Nashville newspaper the following morning. There was no press release, no label announcement, no publicist calling the trades with a carefully worded statement about what had happened on that stage the night before. The RCA men went back to their offices on Monday morning and made no record of having stopped being executives for 4.5 minutes while a man in black played boom-chicka-boom on a borrowed Gibson in a room that had not asked his permission and did not need it. But 2,200 people told 2,200 other people. And those people told others. And by the end of that spring, the night had become the kind of story that travels not because anyone is pushing it but because it is true. And true stories have a momentum that manufactured ones never do. RCA did not drop Dolly Parton after the Porter split. They doubled down. The album she recorded that summer, Here You Come Again, went platinum. Her first crossover. A girl from a 2-room cabin in Locust Ridge, Sevier County, crossing every line Nashville had ever drawn around what she was allowed to be, because she had never believed the lines applied to her and had the voice to prove it. Robert Lee Parton Sr. lived long enough to hear what happened at the Ryman that night, not from a newspaper, not from a telephone call, but from the radio signal that reached all the way up into the hollow. He died 14 months later, in the spring of 1978, in the county where he was born. Dolly did not speak about it publicly. She carried it the way she carried everything that mattered most, privately, completely, without asking anyone else to hold it for her. Johnny Cash's 4-day silence after that night ended differently than the ones before it. June would say later, in a conversation with a close friend in 2001 that was never meant to be repeated but was, that something had shifted in him after the Ryman. Not fixed. Not cured. The word she used was unlocked. The way a room gets unlocked when someone finally finds the right key and turns it, and the door opens not into somewhere new but into somewhere you already knew and had simply lost access to. He kept playing. In 2008, 31 years after that night, a Rolling Stone journalist sat across from Dolly Parton in a hotel room in Los Angeles and asked her about the moments in her career that had changed the direction of everything. She answered 3 of the questions directly. On the 4th, she paused, set her coffee cup down, looked at the window for a moment in a way that meant she was not looking at the window at all. Then she said one sentence. The night I thought I lost everything on that stage, a man in black stood up. I have never forgotten what it feels like to have someone stand up. She did not say his name. The journalist did not ask her to. Some answers are complete exactly as they are. March 14, 1977. Nashville, Tennessee. The Ryman Auditorium. A guitarist's knees buckled on the most important stage in country music. The music stopped. A woman stood at the microphone and asked 2,200 people a question she had never had to ask before, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when everyone is waiting for someone else to be brave. One man stood up. From row 11. Second seat from the aisle. No announcement, no contract, no credit line in any program. He had paid crumpled bills at a box office window and found his seat in the dark and listened the way a craftsman listens to another craftsman, with everything he had, quietly, without needing anyone to know he was there. He did not stand up because Nashville was watching. Nashville had already looked away. He stood up because a friend was on a stage with a guitar going silent, and some things in this life you do not calculate. Some things you do not weigh against what it costs you or what it gets you or what the men in the third row are going to say about it on Monday morning. Some things you simply do, because the doing of them is the whole point of being the kind of person you decided to be a long time ago, in a place far from any stage before anyone was watching. Dolly Parton went on to become one of the most beloved artists in the history of American music. She never forgot where the turning point was. Not in a boardroom. Not on a chart. Not in a trade publication or a platinum certification hanging on a wall. It was on a pine floor in Nashville, on a March night in 1977, when a man she had not called and had not invited and had not asked for anything from stood up in a dark room and walked toward the light because the light needed someone in it. Johnny Cash went on to record the American Recording Series in the 1990s, 4 albums, stripped down to one voice and one guitar, no production layered over the truth to make it easier to sell. The work reminded the world what an honest sound does to a room when there is nothing between the music and the people listening. He played until the year he died. He never stopped. Some people look at an empty stage and see an ending. Some people look at an empty stage and pick up a guitar. The ones who pick up the guitar, quietly, without being asked, without waiting for permission from anyone who has never had the courage to stand up themselves, those are the ones that history does not forget, even when it tries. If this story reached you somewhere real, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we come back here and tell the stories that almost did not survive, the ones history filed away in the wrong drawer, the ones the industry hoped you would not go looking for. They are worth looking for. Which moment in your own life did you choose to stand up when it would have been easier to stay sitting down? Drop it in the comments. Every answer belongs here.